So I do think that, there are cultural things in terms of how it is that we develop those different models that are reflected in how it is that we grow up.
Welcome back to ISSR in Conversation here on the ISSR YouTube channel and major podcast services. As always, I am Anthony K. Nairn, ISSR Executive Assistant. This is the final entry of the 4-part series on ISSR's recently completed grant, generously funded by the Templeton World Charity Foundation, titled Understanding Spiritual Intelligence, or SI for short. This 4-part series, which was recorded live on Zoom between 28 June and 10 July 2023, followed in the wake of the 2023 ISSR Summer Conference on Artificial and Spiritual Intelligence, from which a few of those keynote presentations will be posted to our channel in the coming months. The speakers in this series, all presenters at the conference, were critical in bringing together the research and deliverables of this grant project. This final part, presented live on Zoom on 10 July 2023, titled Paying Attention to Spiritual Meanings, Modeling Spiritual Practices Using Interacting Cognitive Subsystems, begins with an introduction from ISSR Executive Secretary Fraser. The developer of the cognitive architecture used for this grant project, Philip Bernard, then provides an in-depth presentation of his architectural design and insights into the process, among many other interesting details. This is then followed by responses from both John Teasdale and Fraser, after which an open discussion with the audience takes place. Please enjoy the final episode of this special 4-part series of ISSR in Conversation on the topic of spiritual intelligence.
Welcome to this 4th and last of the Zoom sessions arising from our Spiritual Intelligence project. This one is about paying attention to spiritual meanings, modeling spiritual practices using interacting cognitive subsystems. And the main presentation comes from Philip Barnard, who's developed that particular cognitive architecture, and then John Teasdale and I will pitch in a bit later on. Philip, over to you.
Well, let me start by saying a little something about what interacting cognitive subsystems actually is. ICS is a theory of our overall mental architecture, how it's organized and what the various bits and pieces do. It encompasses sensory, central, and effector subsystems of mind. It looks like a box and arrow model of the traditional kind of cognitive 1960s type, but it actually supports analysis of embodied, naturally embedded, and extended ideation. The crucial point, which many of you will already know, is that ICS focuses attention on 2 types of meaning. One of these is purely conceptual, the other is holistic, intuitive, and embodied. And the interaction between these 2 forms of meaning create the central engine of human cognitive affective ideation. And the theory as a whole was developed as an applicable theory that's computationally realizable. And it's been applied in human-computer interaction, a range of mental health applications, creativity in the arts, archaeology, and in the case of this particular project, spirituality. The focus today is about contemplative practices. And what I've got to say reflects a long-term theoretical dialogue about ICS with my friend John Teasdale about whim, which is what happens in mindfulness. And he's recently published a very instructive book on this topic. And the core theme of this is understanding how control of the mind is rebalanced from conceptual goal-based ideation or knowing to a more holistic, intuitive form of knowing that involves the intentional, creative, and moment-to-moment emergence of novel, holistic mental models. Inner awakening, in John's account, involves the emergence out of that process of rebalancing of dormant, holistic, intuitive system supramodels, which he calls holisms, that capture deep regularities or invariance and create experiences of non-instrumental awareness. And I'm sure he'll have a little bit to say about that after I finish. And the overall intention here is to let a wider audience grasp a common structure or deep structure of knowing that could be shared by a pretty wide range of spiritual traditions. My agenda today involves a slightly different lens, because the project that Fraser has been curating has an element that needs us to build bridges between very generic statements like rebalancing what goes on in the mind to providing more formal specifications that will enable us to develop empirically grounded cognitive models of such practices that are potentially computationally realizable. So for the first half of this talk, I'm going to introduce ICS and the concept of an attentional score, which will play a vital role in what I want to do today. And then in the second half, I'll examine a few contemplative skills and the properties of experience associated with their use in order to figure out and how to represent and notate attentional scores that describe what's going on in such practices. If there's time at the end, I'll briefly consider prospects for future methodologies that might go beyond purely verbal theories. What I want to extend here is an argument that John and I originally presented at the International Symposium for Contemplative Studies in Denver in 2012, which was a cognitive evolutionary account of mindfulness, suffering, and cognition. Core feature of this was the point that mindfulness is not a state, but a patterning of mental control over time. And that a basic mammalian mind, like a wolf, oxen, or a cat, has really only got one central subsystem on which attention can be focused, and that provides a multimodal synthesis. And attention there is also accompanied by periodic glances at more detailed visual, auditory, and body state information. Now, obviously, we humans have much, much more complex minds, and we have to learn how to distribute our attention over many subsystems of mind. And more often than not, the distribution of that attention is in the service of conceptually driven doing rather than being. It's what our modern educational systems train us to do. And that contemplation or mindfulness returns the patterning of mental control over time to something much closer to the basic mammalian formula, but it's massively augmented by an internal dialogue between the two meaning systems that I've already mentioned. So I'll first deal with a basic mammalian mind that in some sense is waiting to be augmented. And in the next few slides, there's going to be a little bit of technical supporting detail. Now, you don't need to remember this detail, but the important point is that it's there. We can't do specifications unless we have supporting detail that enables us to formalize models. So the key point that you really are going to need to carry forward from this account is that attention, cognitive control, meanings, and knowledge are all basically the same stuff. They're just patterns of data that are extended in time. So here are a couple of wolves paying attention to being. They're just sitting there, presumably looking out over some kind of landscape. And the core claim is that this is the kind of mind that they're using to do that. It's an overall architecture that's composed of 4 basic units, or Bs, called subsystems. And each of these subsystems has the same internal components. They have a memory, an image, and a collection of processes. There are 3 subsystems that deal with sensory or perceptual information, visual, body state, and acoustic subsystems. And there's a single multimodal subsystem that integrates the products of that perceptual processing and uses affect or emotions to control action selection in an adaptive way in the world. Now, there's 2 kinds of flow patterns here about how information is exchanged among subsystems. There's a kind of forward composition process whereby input from visual and body state and acoustic stuff are composed in a multimodal, more abstract representation. And then the gray arrows reflect an inverse priming or decomposition process. So you can think of, you know, if it looks like a dog and sounds like a dog, it's probably going to smell like a dog. So if you have a multimodal synthesis in which you can hear and smell something that conforms to the dog schema, then the inverse priming or top-down feedback will put into the visual image an abstract specification of what a dog looks like. So that kind of dialogue is forward flow and inverse priming is the basic control mechanism that is working to build and control attention over time. So we think about what might be going on. In each of those subsystems, there's something called an image. And the image is what we understand to be, in the case of a visual image, what we see out there in the world. The acoustic image is what we hear out there in the world. Body state image is what we're feeling in the body in the moment. And a multimodal image is a more abstract synthesis of all of those things. It's a feeling. It might be anticipation of food, for example. And what we see here is a case where perhaps the wolf is sitting there focusing its attention on its multimodal synthesis when it hears a sound. So it moves its attention within its mental landscape from the multimodal image. Briefly, it glances at the acoustic image to get a rough fix on where the sound is coming from in space. It then shifts attention again to the visual image to identify whether something's there. And let's suppose there's nothing there of any significance. It returns attention to its body state to settle back down in position and returns to a focus on its multimodal image. So its attention is moving around its mental landscape. And this is just a simple alerting response of the sort that you'd expect a young wolf to learn very early on in its development. And there are a couple of points about this. First of all, that the home state for focal awareness is obviously most adaptively located at looking at the multimodal image. That's where the best information is going to be to determine action selection. That's where you'll know whether you're sated, whether you're hungry, whether you're uncomfortable, and whether or not conditions in the world require your attention. But you may need to glance at other aspects of other images to refine the multimodal information in a manner that I've just described for the wolf sitting on the prow of a hill being alerted by information around it. In ICS, focal awareness is linked to how that information is used within a subsystem. I don't know if you just heard my watch joining the conversation. I'll take it off. Images have an extent in time. So you see the drift of my hand, you hear the cadence of a cuckoo, you feel the stroke of when you run your hand over your arm. It's a dynamic in time. It's like there's a window on time which you see, and what the memory component each subsystem does is to learn those patterns. It learns not just what goes with what, but how they're organized over time. And in ICS, focal awareness is actually associated with a rather special condition. In normal processing, information is just, I don't know if you can, I don't know how well you can see this display, but information can be directly processed through a subsystem, ignoring the image altogether. Once we've learned how to manage information, it can be processed straight through. The alternative is for the information to be processed from the active image that's present at the time, which is regarded as a more robust form of processing because there's more information in there. It's got a temporal dimension, which means there's much more to go on. And that in ICS is associated with focal awareness. So when you're looking and focusing on visual information, that system is being buffered. If you're focusing on body state, then that image is being buffered. And the crucial point about this is that it determines the pattern of which information is received in the multimodal subsystem. So I've got a little array here again, which you can probably see, which means that if the information is buffered at the multimodal system, the home state, then information from all of the three other subsystems arrives in temporal synchrony. If you're listening to a sound, then that information will be lagged when it arrives because it's gone to two stages. It's been copied in the image and then processed from the image. So the important point here is that what you're attending to, you don't need a spotlight. It's implicitly in the information that arrives. The information that arrives at the multimodal image tells you how the system is organized. So what is modeled in that system is a model of attention as well as the information that is being attended to. And the same thing applies with sensory images. They will reflect any feedback information that is fed back into the image at a lag from, sorry, I think I've gone, at a lag, at a lag from relative to the actual arriving information. So the point about all of this is that the temporal shifts and offsets in both sensory and multimodal images contain a history, not just of what was processed, but how it was processed and how it can best adaptively be used to control action selection. And that, just as an aside, we can discuss it later if necessary, phenomenal awareness is what stabilizes noisy and lagged image content. So you can think of phenomenal awareness as something that smooths over those millisecond jitter in all of the changes. It averages them out, but it knows what's going on underneath. The final point from the wolf is that its meaning system, if you like, its multimodal meaning system, can correlate on physics. So if you think about properties, heavy objects are hard to push, they require more force. There's correlations between the control of action and various kind of perceptual bodily feedback and visual stuff. And we've looked at this, and indeed John discusses it in his book, about patterns of multimodal information. So if you show a child these two figures, a billowing shape and a shark shape, they will automatically link them and associate them with Alumu and Takati. The sharp shape goes with Takati, the round shape goes with Alumu. The same is true of softness of cushions or piercing thorns, hot chocolate, lemon juice, lapping waves, breaking glass, embracing actions or stabbing actions. These have underlying invariants that are very often fall into patterns that discriminate between comfort and likely pain. So we can think of this wolf as not just responding from conditioned responses to execute learned action patterns. It's actually building quite complicated mental models of self, the world, and others that are likely to change if, for example, the wolf's social status in the group changes. So what I want you to carry forward from this is the idea that what is attended and how it is attended to are intimately coupled in these patterns of forward flow and inverse priming. Attention and dynamic resonances are latent parts and parcels of knowing. They evolve together and are modeled together. Attention and cognitive control are distributed. There is no central executive, master program, conflict resolution rules, or homunculus. Rather like a string quartet, the performance of this architecture is coordinated by the equivalent of musical scores that are available to each of the subsystems and emerges out of system-wide interactions. So we've inherited the same deep coupling of the stuff that's in our mind and how we attend to that stuff by glancing and looking around our internal mental landscape. What we've just described for the wolf is in some sense the ground zero of human holistic intuitive knowing. But of course ours is augmented by many extra skills that we've got, which I'll describe in a minute. And that stuff, amongst the augmenting stuff, is the things that comprise many different facets of goal-based knowing. What we've got, of course, is provides massive cognitive benefits, but it also provides much more challenges in system-wide control of attention and of grasping deep patterns in how ineffable meanings rather than direct moment-to-moment multimodal states affect what we think and do. So here's a picture of me 2 decades ago sharing some conceptual knowing in a seminar at the Cognition and Brain Sciences unit. And here, obviously, there's complex manipulation of stuff. There are many tools in there. There's visual spatial imagery in terms of information on display. We're using language, paper-based external memories, and there are many abstract concepts being discussed and actually leading to occasionally affect-laden arguments. And the interaction among the agents in this room are coordinated by shared mental models of cultural conventions about the way in which you behave in seminars, which we've learned as a consequence, hopefully, of our academic training. And here's the augmented architecture that constitutes the full interacting cognitive subsystems. And the key point to note here is that the overall 9-subsystem architecture inherits that 4-subsystem precursor of the wolf mind. What I've done is to relabel the multimodal subsystem as the implicational meaning subsystem here, because by the time we get to human ideation, we've got 2 meaning systems, a propositional meaning system and an implicational meaning system, and they talk to each other, and that's the stuff that enables us humans to reorder ideas and substitute ideas and be creative and control all sorts of things in the world. These were added, we've written quite extensively about the actual evolutionary process. Manual dexterity emerged first, and once you could manipulate things, that provide enabling conditions for developing a more abstract sense of spatial praxic control, which was shared by our last common ancestor with great apes. That process repeated with vocal dexterity and the development of phonology. And once you've got complex manipulation and talking about it, the common underlying invariants that characterize what those 2 things have in common are abstract properties and relationships that we would describe in terms of propositional meanings and things like semantic roles. And when that system came out, that gives us the final architecture. And so now we've got much more in the way of qualitative differences in image contents. We've got the ability to construct images in the mind's eye and ears. We've got deeper levels of abstraction and meaning that enable us, for example, to understand why it is that Alumu and Takati have something in common with those abstract shapes. We have a central engine of cognition that can drive the evolution of thought processes. And we've got the ability to conjure up images in the mind's eye or words in the mind's eye. And all of these things can go on at the same time. This is an architecture that can walk, talk, think, and chew gum at the same time. But of course, moving attention around this mind is much more complex. We would have to, in principle, have a musical score of 9, a nonet rather than a quartet. And here I've just given a simple example of, say, me looking at the display, trying to design a visual score, thinking about propositional image content along this section, noticing in the visual, suddenly noticing in the visual image that there's something wrong. So I drag the diagram to the waste bin, I hear a ping, I then think verbally a bit about what's wrong, and I go back to redesigning the process. So it's a much more complex process of shifts of attention between and among levels of representation. And we've studied some aspects of this, and I'm going to use the example of creative processes in dance, where I worked for a long time with a choreographer who was a contemporary choreographer, and when he was making new movement material, he had his dancers work with cognitive tasks in which he would either give them visual imagery or instructions about music, and they were asked to generate new movement material by trying things out over time. While they were doing it in the dance studio, we stopped them every 4 minutes and asked them what was going through their head just in the moment before we stopped them. And if you talk to a normal dancer about this, they just say, oh, I think with my body and I take intuitive decisions. And by stopping them and actually mapping what they were thinking about, you'll notice from this kind of weird spider web diagram that when they're making dance material in the context of a visual image, in this case of a bell, then they're mostly thinking about visual imagery. If you stop them, they've got an image in their mind. If they're making in relation to musical feeling, it's much more likely that they'll have a verbal thought. They're extremely unlikely to be having an intuition. They're working cognitively and they're shifting their attention between all of these different images in their mind's architecture. And by reflecting back to our dancers what they were doing, they understood that they weren't actually making dance material in the way in which they thought they were making it. We gave them a kind of meta-awareness of what it was that they were doing that then empowered them to make dance in new ways. And we developed a suite of thinking tools that enabled allegedly improved their creativity. And we could sort of describe this whole process in a way that is a bit like a musical score based on the concepts of the architectural form. So here's a musical score in which we mark out an attention, a bit like the key in which the music is being played. We notate the time dynamic, whether or not they're looking at a particular kind of representation, whether they're just glancing at it, whether they're glancing, looking, and so on. We can capture the time dynamic, the locus of control in the mental landscape, where their focal awareness is at the time, and what kind of themes they're doing here. So here we've got, I don't know if you can see my little arrow, but here they're working with images generated from propositions into that spatial loop in the mind's eye of generating a bell. Then they're repeatedly testing it by examining the body state feedback that is coming into the implicational subsystem to figure out whether or not they feel right with that particular movement. And then towards the end of this first line of score, they have a significant moment in which they decide that that's enough on that. They're going to change what they do. They rotate the image of the bell in their mind's eye, and then they describe it again repetitively, and so on. So we can effectively use an analog of a musical score to describe how attention in the mind is deployed whilst they're making movement. And so these scores are essentially the stuff of what the mind is conjointly putting together and building mental models of. In this case, it reflects inactive creative ideation in response to spatial praxic imagery. And again, attention to what's going on is an integral part of knowledge. It's not a spotlight or a homunculus that's melded, and the melding of attention and knowledge and information in images in the mind is distributed cognitive control. We don't need anything else to do it. It's just implicit in what goes on. At this point, I really would like everybody to notice that the melding of what and how in cognitive control is why the control of attention in, say, mindfulness and other forms of contemplation is so important. And by looking across many different cases, we can ask the question, is there a grammar? Is there some kind of systematicity from which we can derive principles that will enable us to build more formal cognitive models later? So just going back to that particular little bit of score that I showed earlier, at the end of each line, what you see here is there's a period of trying, of repeating variations on a theme, rather like in music, and then there's a significant moment where either something is resolved or there is a shift, something invokes a shift to a new theme. So there's kind of a grammar as you go along each of these lines, where there's a long look involving particular forms of alternations, and then a glance leads to a change, and then we land up with something equivalent of cadence at the end of the score, where actually the movement for the dancer feels right. They're going to go with that particular move. And of course, if we were to look at something like rumination in depressed states, which I've drawn a very simple equivalent of here, an individual who's experiencing an episode of major depressive disorder may be thinking about how rotten, what a useless person they are just in the course of their everyday life. And they may be doing something like making coffee, which requires spatial praxic imagery in the mind's eye to get all of the bits right. But while they're doing that, in the background, there's repetitive thinking about useless self at work, at home, and sport, which has a structure rather like the dancer trying out different movements. And then suddenly they accidentally drop the cup, and there's a significant moment of catastrophic thinking, which then leads back into a repeated pattern. So what one can conclude from this is that there is a hint, if you like, of a common structure here in both dance making and rumination that involves something that might have a common underlying parameter, that there's a relatively high rate of reconfiguring the mind over time across these things. One is creatively productive and the other is stuck in a thematic mental rut. So in one case, you get something that is more a dendritic outcome, creative outcome, where novel mental models can form, and the other case, just the same models get reinstated. And this is clearly massively more intricate than our earlier account of a wolf mind. So equally, we could then just sort of write a score for aspects of mindfulness-based training, where the intention is to acquire new skills of attending, and in which people are trained to just note broader feelings and stop having extended looks at conceptual meanings and their verbal realizations. So across this score, every time something comes in, there's a little thing here to note that verbal thought and allow it to pass, or to return the focus of attention to the breath, and then simply note broader feelings or note things, so that actually ideation is allowed to go on rather than get stuck in a rut. So through the scoring method, we can think about how to represent relationships between content, the time dynamic, the intention that's in place at the time. And again, there are quite strong hints that there are likely to be regularities that would be underlying similar cases where innovative models get developed, or where the same models get reinstantiated. And certainly, if we start thinking this way, we can start to ask questions about what commonalities might exist among different therapeutic forms and contemplative practices. And this is particularly interesting because from a clinical perspective, many third wave cognitive therapies are what they are because they try to blend aspects of meditative practices with traditional cognitive elements in therapeutic interventions. One thing that one might want to argue is that in all of these cases, they're developing and directing the control of cognition of affect more in a form of intuitive knowing that is quite different from classic CBT and its reliance on modifying conceptual knowledge and challenging thought. And again, we can have an analogy with music. A 4-part symphonic form is realized in many unique ways by different composers. They're stunningly different, but they have the same underlying structure in terms of which movement follows what movements. They all share patterns of repeated musical motifs and stuff like this. And they're all obviously based on orchestral scale combinations of instruments. So I've already illustrated a candidate score for mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, but we can ask questions now about what other forms of contemplative practice could be open to similar forms of analysis, and specifically those in the context of Fraser's project, spiritual practices. I'm going to look very briefly at commonalities between a technique called focusing, which was originally developed by Gendlin in a clinical context. He was a clinical psychologist. I'll also mention Rex Ambler's experiment with light. He's a Quaker theologian who developed a process that turned out to have stunning similarities with Gendlin's focusing. And I'll also mention a wonderful piece of work by an Augustinian monk called Martin Laird, who described in a book called Into the Silent Land, which is about the use of prayer words in support of deep contemplative practices. And also I'll have a few things to say about the Jesus prayer. We have to acknowledge at the outset that sort of, musical notations have been around for centuries, and they've been subject to a lot of development, and people know pretty much what they're doing with them. They're very mature. We don't have any kind of agreement about what mental architecture is, let alone how to actually determine how to think about scores. So I'm playing with an idea that I hope will have some utility in the future. One thing that is very clear is that we need to mark what we're doing with self-state or opening intentions, or the intentional stance of what frame of mind the individual is and what they're trying to do, whether it's instrumental or non-instrumental, approach to ideation. We also need to acknowledge that there are going to be varying endpoints to a score. So you can't think of contemplative practices as something that start at point A and then always land up at something that looks like point B. They don't all land up with a crescendo of insight about the light. Sometimes after a session of yoga, you might just feel a bit more relaxed and nothing more. So we need to understand how it is that what goes on in a line of score relates to how particular endpoints might emerge. We also, with a complex architecture like ICS, need to manage the issue of what's going on with concurrent mental activity. For those of you who've read The Way of a Pilgrim, where the pilgrim is after the target of unceasing prayer, then they want to be able to conduct their everyday life whilst they are praying at the same time, which means that we need to be able to manage different threads, rather like computer scientists need to manage multiple threads of processing that are going on in highly concurrent problem-solving tasks. Unlike symphonic forms, when it comes to figuring out what's going on in meditational practices, there's no agreement about how many movements are involved. I've got a directory on my computer that has titles of papers about involving the numbers of steps in meditation that vary from 4 steps to 21 steps. So each kind of approach tends to parse what's going on in very different ways. What I kind of like about having had the opportunity in Fraser's project to look over some of these things in addition to my more traditional interests is that it's pretty clear to me that there are many recurrent threads and topics that come up across meditative practices and across clinical interventions. But there's a stunning variation in the vocabularies and languages that are used to describe them. So unless you belong to a particular community of practice, you may not necessarily understand much of those, of the particular forms of words. So here are some themes that I've extracted as being in common. One is stilling the mind and controlling mind-wandering distractions. One is developing setting conditions for staging a particular kind of non-instrumental internal dialogue in the mind about meanings. Very often there are ways of directing individuals how to observe and witness thoughts rather than controlling thoughts. So allowing patterns to emerge over time rather than seeking to achieve particular objectives. And then another common theme is facing up to the difficult stuff, dukkha, accepting and welcoming stresses that occur in the emerging patterns of thought. Another one is inquiring or probing the nature of ongoing meanings, including awareness itself. Particularly in a spiritual context, there's often injecting semantic content through scriptures or remembering teachings to increase maybe the semantic field that's being addressed or from which patterns can emerge. And then finally, there's across all of these traditions, there seem to be ways of framing emergent patterns of ineffable meanings in ways that can be shared through, for example, metaphors. Let me just, I know that some of you will already know about Genlin's 6-step model. This predated MBCT by quite a long time, but it's got some interesting commonalities underneath it. First of all, Genlin asked people to clear a space, to find a comfortable, quiet space where they can quieten the mind, and then identify a felt sense. And a felt sense is a feeling about something that might be wrong with life, the universe, and everything at that point. And then the emphasis of this process is to let the response come from your body. That is, it is deliberately kind of trying to get you to focus how your body itself might be telling you something. And then the instruction is to give that felt sense a handle, which is basically to give it a description that seems to fit some aspect of that felt sense. and then to test it, to resonate it, to sort of examine whether or not that handle does work well with the felt sense or whether it needs to be modified and changed. Then to inquire, to try and ask more questions of what that felt sense is all about, and then to receive the experience. That is, to don't judge it, just let it tell you what's going on. And this was a clinical process that Genlin discovered for himself, actually, when he had his own mental health trials, but he then developed it into a technique, a self-help tool for individuals who found this kind of approach accommodating. Rex Ambler is an interesting Quaker theologian who John actually put me onto at one stage, who was baffled by what early Quakers like Fox actually believed. That is, reading their writings, he was severely challenged by what it was that they were saying and what their underlying belief structure might be. And along the way, he realized that, that probably the heart of it all was that they shared a common meditative practice, and that in order to understand what they were doing and why it was important, you had to translate that process into modern language. And so he wrote some great stuff where he does go through the writings of original Quaker thinkers and translate it into modern English in a way that enables you to see something about what they're doing. So he developed a process, again, in response to his own mental health challenges, to help him accommodate them and develop an understanding, which he then turned into a meditational practice in which bears very strong resemblances to Genlin's focusing. So the first statement is to mind the light, which is to pay attention to what's going on inside you, particularly where there's something that makes you feel uncomfortable. Second step is to open your heart to the truth. Don't run away from anything that's difficult or that you don't want to face, but keep a little distance from. Be still and cool in thy mind. Wait in the light. Be patient. Let the light show you what's really going on. Ask questions if what is being offered to you isn't clear or you want to know more, and wait for the answers to come. Don't try to explain. Submit, accept and welcome the information or images and the insights, dreams and perceptions that may come later, and allow them to show the truth. And this is now a process which various Quaker communities meet to go through on a regular basis. But again, you can see that there's considerable similarity between the therapeutic intervention advocated by Genlin, but it's phrased in a very different way. It has different elements, but it feels very strongly as if there's some underlying commonalities. Into the Silent Land, in his book, Martin Laird describes things not so much in terms of stages of things to do, but of enabling conditions for moving on in the meditative position and progression. And so he really advocates being aware of doorways that you have to pass through in order to get to the next phase of meditative understandings. And I like that because of this characteristic that it's capturing enabling conditions. And he's using a prayer word as a central part of his process, which he describes as an anchor to constantly return to, instead of the innumerable internal videos. When the reasoning mind is not needed for some task, we've passed through the first doorway of the present moment. The awkwardness of self-consciousness is gone. In the case of his second doorway, he describes it in the following way. Approaching it, the stillness of the prayer word allows not only the resentful thought to be spotted, but also the mental emotion pattern that undergirds the thought. The prayer word has changed from being like a shield of protection to being a riverbed at one with the river. The riverbed makes no comment on what is coming from upstream and passing downstream. Receiving and letting go are one act. Awareness is the eye of silence. Train the mind not to spin commentaries. So already from these two descriptions, I'm sure you can all see commonalities between the idea of stilling the mind, of stopping recurrent loops going on, just expressed in a very different way from other traditions. The third doorway is this kind of final step to moving into deep contemplation. He says, crossing the threshold of the third doorway requires vigilant waiting in the silence of just being. Thoughts appear and disappear in awareness. Now shift your attention to what is aware of the thought, the awareness itself. And crossing the third doorway, we encounter the ineffable, the ground that is the core of all being, an indescribable vastness. Silence washes into the shores of perception, making it stretch to receive in metaphors of light, union, calm, spaciousness. We begin to see that there's something deeper than the chaos within. So again, I hope you can all recognize that there are clearly commonalities in terms of the management of thinking processes amongst these different processes that are creating enabling conditions for patterns to emerge. Interestingly, and I think it's important from modeling processes, Laird notes that doorways are double hinged. That is, you can think you're approaching and you can go through one doorway and then suddenly you're back to where you were before. That is, it's a dynamic that requires really quite complex description. The Jesus prayer, I know a number of you here actually do this kind of contemplation and practice, but it has many realizations, but the core point is that you repeat a very short prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, or some equivalent, over and over again. And this particular description says that each time you say the prayer, try to sink deeper and deeper into awareness of Jesus's presence. In this very moment, he's with you and sustaining you, offering you loving compassion in your time of need. So armed with the mental architecture, we can now ask a set of questions about how configurations are playing into these different activities and how we might score the distribution of attention over time within those configurations. So the starting point here was the paper by John Teasdale and myself from 2012, where the idea was that we were returning the control of the mind to something very similar to that of a basic mammal, but augmented by the increased capabilities of human ideation. And in the left-hand panel of this slide, I've highlighted attention to implicational meaning as being the heart of this kind of mindful state, where actually in mindful living, where you're trying to be mindful in everyday life, you are in a visual environment with a body state, but your attention is focused on implicational being, and you're only at best glancing at visual, body state, acoustic, and propositional information. So the idea of being able to glance at the propositional as well as the other things is why wolves can be present in the moment, but only humans in some sense can be truly mindful, because it requires that propositional augmentation. In the right-hand diagram, I'm trying to capture something much more like the configuration that would underlie a very deep contemplative state and the scores required for that. Because if there isn't much going on in the visual and acoustic domain, it is the relationship of the body to the two meaning systems that are the reciprocal processes of control that are going on. So, for example, being in a state like this, where implicational meaning and the intention that go with some of the deeper, having gone through the third, let's say, Laird's third doorway, you can think of this as being something like a more information processing characterization on what Laird is describing when he refers to an eye on silence. That is, there's no verbal chatter or visual spatial imagery or external inputs. There is just the body talking to implicational meaning and observing the flow of information within the central engine of ideation, which will feel in that particular kind of configuration mostly pretty ineffable. It's interesting to think about Laird's use of the prayer word or the Jesus prayer, because Laird has this wonderful metaphor of a riverbed, and actually the prayer word is a vocalization, sub-vocalization, where you are actually getting body state feedback from that action. And if you're also using a prayer rope, then you're in a situation rather like you've got in the left-hand diagram here, where the riverbed is that you need to realize that the output to the articulatory and skeletal things go behind propositional meaning here. It doesn't actually enter into and come out of it. So you've got a kind of structure where there is a flow of information with rhythmic patterns and semantic content associated with the prayer word, constantly flowing through that configural pattern. And you can think of that a bit like figure and ground phenomena in human perception. You're providing a ground where the spiritual associations linked to the prayer word are constantly reactivating implicational schemata and enabling a rich implicational image space to be in the focus of awareness at the time. In the case of the Way of the Pilgrim, for those of you who remember the detail of this, the pilgrim is able to constantly repeat the Jesus prayer throughout the day whilst going about their daily business. And this would upset most cognitive models in psychology hugely, because they don't have the computational capability for that kind of distributed control. But here we can understand how once it all becomes very automated, the local control mechanisms are there such that Laird's riverbed can be trained to be active the whole time, whilst other activities can go on in the mind at the same time. So here I've basically shown that if you activate that loop, there's nothing to stop, for example, subvocal articulation reactivating spiritual meanings in the implicational image, and keeping that going. And that at the same time, if you're sustaining and injecting thoughts, say from, in the Way of a Pilgrim's case, from the Philokalia, then that is all maintaining and enriching an implicational landscape whilst you're able to perform all the other tasks at the same time. It's something that requires massive levels of expertise, but is perfectly plausible within this, and helps us to understand actually how spiritual senses of meaning can be sustained in the moment in a continual way. And that's just sort of the configural thing. The configural thing doesn't actually tell us what the overall pattern of control is, but we can start to think about how training methods influence the way in which the architecture is behaving to bring about change of the thought that we could eventually introduce into cognitive models. And the relative parameters aren't actually rocket science or rocket cognitive science. We've already talked about things like stabilizing image content and the rates of changes. So when you settle into a meditative practice, you are actually attenuating or stabilizing image content in the three sensory and effector subsystems. Stabilization, where things are repetitive, are things, or stable, mean that no control interventions are necessary. They can just keep kind of going on relatively automatic pilot, and they can be distributed throughout the architecture. The activities of the reasoning mind described by Laird or any other things are mediated by these three internal loop patterns here in the right-hand side. And they're typically controlled and coordinated, as is indicated here, from the conceptual level of understanding. So the intersection of the reasoning mind is on propositional meaning. And so attentional scores for most reasoning processes, like goal-based activities in many of the traditional AI programs, will all be centered on propositional meaning. And obviously our wolf doesn't have to worry about this because it doesn't have that kind of thing. But most of the attempts to stop activity in the two side loops of spatial praxic thinking and phonological thinking are, you know, if a thought or an image emerges, it allows it to pass so that you effectively get to draw attention away from those peripheral loops and into the central engine loop. Here, recognizing and noting distractions and allowing concerns to come to mind non-judgmentally, or returning to an anchor of the breath or the prayer word or whatever, are effectively all operating to stop extended looks at information over time that will complicate the patterns that are going into the implication image, because they've got longer lags, they're longer threads, they're less interrelationships. It's much more sensible to focus on that idea of maintaining attention at the implicational image and just merely glancing at the others to stop off thought. So many of the techniques that involve, for example, giving a felt sense a handle, a name, does it feel right, resonating, they're techniques to start to bring attention into this exchange of patterns of implicational meanings and patterns of propositional meaning. And where things don't fit or resonate, attention and focus will be drawn to implicational meanings, because that's where in this model affect is marked. There is no affect in the propositional system. So a pattern of mental dialogue is a principle here is that the pattern of mental dialogue is effectively training the mind to focus more on the bigger picture of implicational meanings. If we can promote a sustained pattern of attention to implicational meaning, then that will be reflected by the ineffable nature of the meaning system. Fraser has written a lot about this himself, and I'll refer you to his chapters for more detail on that. And the key point of that is that it creates conditions which John describes very adequately in his book, What Happens in Mindfulness, for dendritic creative novel patterns to develop. And when they come to resonate and fit, they produce a state linked to positive affect. I mean, elsewhere I've sort of documented a little bit that when that loop goes out of control, you get manic euphoria rather than useful insight. So in some sense, the final movement for a unifying or resolving cadence is that idea that is encapsulated in a lot of these techniques of receiving, accepting, welcoming, submitting. You know, the final movement that you might want to sort of characterize your scores that have landed up with some kind of successful resolution is supported by being able to receive or accept non-judgmentally the new patterns as they emerge. Across all of these techniques, there's a whole raft of different equivalents to musical motifs that exist that accompany witnessing. There may be thematic meditation exercises, scripture fragments, teaching, hints for grasping ineffable experiences from gurus and so on. And they'll help you link to pre-existing culturally framed schemata. But the witnessing and perturbations of implicational meanings creates conditions here for finding new and deeper patterns. And it's in this sense, I like to argue that contemplative practices reinstate a less complex pattern of control, where, like the simpler mammalian mind, the focus is on an augmented form of multimodal meaning, where conceptual meaning is playing its part, but where the deeper patterns of underlying synthesis are able to emerge. The fact that all of this is mediated by different technical lags means that we have a means effectively of describing why attention to meaning is so important and how it is that we might go about computationally modeling it, because it would be contained within parameters of lags within system. This dialogue between implicational meaning and propositional meaning is what enables elements of ideas to be substituted and reorganized. That's what makes us humans so clever. The clutter that comes with all of the other stuff in the architecture means that we have to develop techniques to keep that clutter under control. And the kind of resonances that can occur in contemplative practices are realized within repeated cycles of composition and decomposition, mediated by discrepant or harmonic matches in varying degrees. I'm just going to finish with the idea that we could, I'm moving towards a candidate language now, where if you look at the scores which notate which parts of the mental mechanism are in use, which parts have a focus of attention. So this is a score, as you'll see, from the black highlighted implic, where the focus of attention, be it looking or glancing, is predominantly at the implicational image. There's a line for the themes that are active at a particular time, and there's the equivalent of a bass clef for concurrent feeds, where, for example, anchors or other techniques are brought into play. And that hopefully this kind of notation, if it were used in the manner of linguistics, we could look across different practices and try and pull out the systematicities and the rules governing them in a way that we could then model by capturing the parameters. And although there will be an infinity of particular scores, there should be an emergent pattern. So much like our dancers, the sort of spider diagram I was showing before, contemplative practices and models of contemplative practices should generate states where the distribution of attention over time becomes very much like what's going on in the right-hand side here, where the focus of attention rests largely at the intuitive or implicational kind of meaning, and much less on the verbal thoughts and the propositional meaning. And that the idea of constructing scores and generating a grammar for how those scores work should help us not only model it, but develop ways of training people to do it. Thank you, I'll stop there.
That's marvelous, Phil. Thanks very much. A lot of technical detail there, very clearly conveyed and bang on time. You exactly an hour, I think, a few minutes under. So thank you very much indeed. We've got John Teasdale here. Grateful that John's been able to join us, and Philip's already mentioned his book on what happens in mindfulness, and I'd like to bring in John right now. We'll come to questions later. But over to John. Thanks very much, John Teasdale.
Thanks, Fraser, and thanks very much, Phil. I want to continue the exploration of paying attention to spiritual meanings within the ICS framework that Phil's begun in such detail. And I want to take it in a slightly different direction. Now, one of the great attractions to me of this ICS framework is that it offers a comprehensive, integrative approach within which we can develop analyses of complex and often subtle phenomena. And as Phil has indicated, it allows us both to develop a sort of narrow focus, fine detailed analysis of moment-to-moment process, but it also allows us to develop ideas at a wider system level view, such as the idea that all contemplative practices share as a core feature a shift in overall control of the heart-mind from conceptual knowing to holistic intuitive knowing. And just to be clear, what I'm calling conceptual knowing maps onto what Phil calls propositional knowing, and what I call holistic intuitive knowing maps onto what Phil calls implicational meaning. It's simply when I was writing for a more general audience, I thought that might be an easier way, more accessible way to communicate the difference. But crucially, one of the huge advantages for ICS, from my point of view, is that when we're focusing at this more general macro level, we can have confidence that the ideas developed within the ICS approach can be grounded and tested in an approach that's potentially computable and is actually constrained by a small number of core operating principles. So, in other words, ICS provides a disciplined principle approach to thinking at this more macro level. So even though we might be working with a broader brush, we're not just pulling ideas out of thin air. They're constrained and grounded by the principles of operation of the system. So in what will be quite a brief contribution, I'd like to sketch out how the ICS approach to paying attention to higher order meanings offers insights into the metaphor of hidden treasure that recurs in a number of different spiritual traditions. And in my book that Phil kindly mentioned, What Happens in Mindfulness, Inner Awakening and Embodied Cognition, I go into this in much more detail. So this metaphor of hidden treasure points to the potential for a radically different way of seeing and being in the world, a potential that for most of us remains unrealized both in the sense that we don't realize that we've got it, and unrealized in the sense that we don't make it real. Nonetheless, a consistent theme in spiritual traditions is that they assure us that under suitable conditions, this potential can be realized, actualized, and radically transform and enrich our lives. So let me begin with just 3 illustrations of the metaphor. So first of all, from Jesus. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all he had and bought that field. The Sufi Rumi compares our usual human condition to having a lease on a little shop where we barely make a living, sewing patches on torn clothing. Yet beneath the floor run 2 veins of precious carnelian. If we would but rip up just one board from the floor, we would see the treasure glinting in the dark. And finally, from Buddhist tradition, Shantideva compares the awakening heart-mind to discovering a jewel in a heap of rubbish. So this metaphor of hidden treasure, I'd suggest, is related to the possibility of inner awakening, our potential for seeing and being in the world in a radically different way. And the ICS analysis of inner awakening hinges on one of the core central ideas of the ICS approach, that for very good evolutionary reasons, our heart minds, like those of other mammals, have an inherent potential for wholeness, a tendency to discover or create patterns of relatedness between patterns of information, and to represent that relatedness in higher level representations. Now, the patterns of information in these higher order wholes reflect the interrelatedness, the common thread or shared essence, if you like, of the patterns of lower order information, the parts. So the process of whole making can then be repeated at a higher level, so that what were wholes now become parts, and the interrelatedness between these patterns is represented in yet higher level wholes, and so the process continues and one is extracting deeper and deeper regularities in the patterns of information that are passing through the mind. Now, the ICS approach puts this innate potential for discovering and representing ever greater levels of wholeness center stage in its analysis of inner awakening. And in the book that Phil kindly mentioned, What Happens in Mindfulness, Inner Awakening and Embodied Cognition, I introduce this analysis by taking a look at the related but obviously very distinct experience of flow, of being in the zone, which the pioneer researcher Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi described as a state in which people are so involved in an activity that nothing else seems to matter. The experience is so enjoyable that people will continue to do it, even at great cost, for the inner sake, for the sheer sake of doing it. So doing it just for the love of it, for the sake of it, irrespective of what the external outcomes might be. Now, the gist of the ICS analysis of flow is that it arises in situations where holistic intuitive information, rather than conceptual information, controls action. In this way of controlling action, holistic intuitive mental models that reflect the patterns of information in the mind in one moment shape the action made in the next moment. And that action then creates a slightly different pattern of information within the mind, and that's reflected in the state of the mental model that shapes action in the next moment. And so on, that action creates a new pattern, an adjusted mental model, a new action, new information, and so on. And so in that way, a continuing interaction develops in which the inner and outer worlds mutually shape each other moment to moment. So for this way of controlling action to work in the complex and challenging situations in which flow arises, there has to be a continuing adjustment and fine-tuning of the mental models so that they continue to mesh with the ever-changing array of arising information. And when this happens, there'll be a continuing coherence and harmony of mental models both with the arriving information and with each other over time. The heart-mind's inherent potential for discovering and creating wholeness at ever higher levels can then reflect this coherence in higher order mental models that embody themes of continuing wholeness and goodness of fit over time. And as Phil briefly noted in his presentation, within the ICS approach, goodness of fit of mental models evokes positive affect. That's one of the principles in which the evolution, the development of mental models is guided. So we would expect the pattern of processing that I've just described, where we're creating models that reflect the coherence of lower order models over time, to be experienced generally positively. But crucially, the ICS analysis suggests that if we're to have the full experience of flow and the intense joy that goes with it, the higher order mental models reflecting wholeness and goodness of fit over time have to be included in conscious processing. And the feelings of joy and flow they evoke have to be valued and sought for their own sake, for the love of them. We have to learn how to pay attention to these higher order meanings. So I can illustrate what I mean in those relatively abstract terms with a concrete example. This is an account shared with me by a friend of mine who's a surgeon. He's also interested in meditation, and he read the book and also the chapter on flow in What Happens in Mindfulness. And in that chapter, as well as presenting in more detail the kind of analysis I've just sketched out, it mentions that surgeons are one of the groups of people who, along with mountain climbers, chess champions, and others, experience flow. And yet, my friend realized he didn't experience that, even though he worked in quite challenging surgical situations, which would normally be expected, or in other situations might be expected to evoke flow. My friend realized that having come across the idea that higher order mental models are controlling activity in this kind of situation, and that they're already being created and reflecting the coherence, the wholeness over time that's already there. When things were going well, when he was successfully engaging in the complex and challenging surgical procedures, he began to bring his attention to the possibility of experiencing flow. He tuned in to that level of experience, if you like. And wonderfully, he then was actually able to realize, make real this potential that had been available to him for years, but that he hadn't taken awareness to. And now, not only does he often experience the flow and the joy that comes with it, but also he can be very clear about the kinds of conditions that support the arising of flow and the kind of conditions that make it more difficult, and arrange things as best as he can to maximize one and minimize the other. So this is a nice example of what can happen when we become aware of the existence of higher order models and of the possibility of paying attention to them, and so realize the fruits that they can offer. And the core idea that I explore in the book is that what goes on in flow gives us a way to approach understanding what happens in inner awakening, and the crucial role that pay attention to higher order meanings plays in actualizing the possibility for inner awakening that we all share. So, as you know, flow arises in a very restricted range of conditions. The more widespread transformation of our ways of seeing and being that inner awakening involves depends on accessing even higher order mental models that are relevant to all the situations we encounter. So we have to go up to a very high level of abstraction, if you like. And the ICS approach suggests that these very high order mental models that actually model the commonalities across lower order mental models, we call them supramodels, and that the analysis presented in What Happens in Mindfulness suggests that all of us already have these supramodels latent within our heart minds. Throughout our lives, we've been unaware of the fact that our minds have been clocking up these deep regularities, expressing extracting the commonalities that are effectively the distilled essence of all the experiences of wholeness, interrelatedness, and whole-making we've experienced in our lives. And the core suggestion is that these supermodels are hidden treasures. They lie latent within us, already present. They await our awareness, our cultivating the ways of paying attention and the wider conditions that will allow their activities to be consciously realized. And basically, this is what the business of the various spiritual contemplative paths, what the central business of them is about from the point of view of this ICS analysis. And the most fundamental of those conditions is that we need to arrange conditions. We need to cultivate the skills. We need to arrange the conditions that create a shift in the control of the inner conversation between our two ways of knowing, what Phil called the central engine of cognition. We basically, through contemplative practices, learn to shift from a pattern where conceptual knowing and meanings are in control to one where holistic intuitive knowing and meanings hold sway. And the wider aspects of spiritual paths, the surrender, the renunciation, the compassion, the love, can all be seen as the cultivation of ways to enhance that shift, that core shift from the dominance of conceptual knowing, which is our habitual default mode, to one where holistic intuitive knowing holds sway. And that's really one of the key promises, I think, that becoming clearer about the role of paying attention to spiritual meanings can offer. Okay?
Thank you very much, John. Thank you. So the plan is for me to add a few comments now, and then we'll go into general discussion. And I think all three of us who are speaking today are saying very similar overlapping things, perhaps with different phraseology and different emphases, but I don't think there are any real disagreements, just sort of different ways of putting things. One of the intriguing things about spiritual practices is that they're superficially diverse, but seem to achieve very much the same kind of end states. And Phil drew attention to some of the common elements at the procedural level, stilling the mind, observing rather than controlling thoughts, facing difficult stuff, and so on. But there's another level of commonality that we've been trying to get at using this cognitive architecture, ICS. And one of the central aspects of that, I think, is giving implicational, holistic, intuitive cognition freer rein than it normally has, and reining back conceptual cognition to allow more space for the intuitive cognition. But I want to emphasize that that's only a relative shift. I think there are some kinds of intellectual activity which are almost purely conceptual. And it's one of the features of our conceptual intelligence that it just does its own thing in a rather encapsulated way. It is still involved, I think, in the kind of cognition you find in spiritual practices, but in a less controlling way. So I do want to emphasize that, as I see it, conceptual cognition isn't in any sense switched off in spiritual practices, but just works in tandem with our intuitive holistic intelligence in a more supportive role rather than simply doing its own thing. And I think conceptual thinking is always involved in spiritual practices. It's involved in our intentions. If people are doing dedicated mindfulness practice, there's an intention to go into a mindful way of processing. And that intention is I think, normally formed at a conceptual level. It gives rise to a different way of using the cognitive architecture. But I think it stems from conceptual level intentions. And also when people are having spiritual experiences of any kind, one of the key differences, I think, between humans having those and animals, chimps, for example, having what seem to be spiritual experiences from what you can glean from looking at their behavior, is that humans are capable of identifying what it is that they're experiencing and conceptualizing it. And that changes the experience, it enhances it in a way, it gives it greater influence. So in these various ways, I think conceptual cognition is always involved in spiritual practices, but as I say, in a support role rather than a lead role. But I think it's changing the role of conceptual cognition rather than switching over from conceptual cognition to a different kind of intuitive, holistic cognition. But there is certainly a switch in the relationship between those two meaning systems. Something else that I think changes in most spiritual practices is that in most of everyday life, for most of us, there's a lot of cognitive multitasking. We are processing all sorts of different things at the same time. And it's very useful in many ways that we can do that, but it's also kind of wearisome, I think, and people start to long for some kind of relief from that multitasking. I think it's one of the features of spiritual practices that it leads to a much greater enmeshment of the various subsystems in the cognitive architecture. I've already spoken about conceptual cognition not freewheeling in the way it usually does, but other subsystems sometimes get enmeshed in what is going on. One of the things that's intrigued me about the Jesus prayer is the way almost every subsystem gets involved, but in a way that is highly coordinated, much more highly coordinated than you get in everyday life. So people may be saying the words of the Jesus prayer either out loud or under their breaths. If they're using a prayer rope, they're moving their fingers along. There's a lot of activity, closely coordinated activity, which I think amplifies the significance of the underlying spiritual work. I also want to resist any implication, if there is any, and I'm not sure that there is, that implicational cognition is good and conceptual cognition is bad. I think either can be, but I think both meaning systems can be either good or bad for human flourishing, and it depends how they operate. Conceptual cognition can certainly be bad for people. And there's a good example of that in the work that John Teasdale and Philip Barnard have done previously about depression, when conceptual level negative thoughts kind of take over and are bad for people, destabilize them, debilitate them. But there are other kinds of conceptual thoughts, like grateful thoughts, which have been shown to be very helpful for people. And I think in a similar way, implicational holistic intuitive cognition can be either good or bad. I think in depression, to take that example again, there can be gut level negative meanings, not quite articulated, which are very destabilizing. But there can also be the helpful, good, holistic implicational thoughts that John Teasdale's been talking about. I mentioned the spiritual practices are very different. And one of the things we need in this area is some kind of taxonomy of spiritual practices. And I'm currently interested in the one that Rupert Sheldrake has developed. And I'm putting this in my own sort of somewhat cognitive architecture terms rather than in the terms he puts it. But I think there are some practices that take people into states of deep contemplation. When that happens, I think there is minimal activity in a lot of the subsystems, and the focusing down largely on intuitive, holistic, and body state. Sheldrake thinks there are other spiritual practices that focus on the enlightened mind and actually make quite a lot of use of conceptual cognition. And he gives gratitude as an example of those kinds of spiritual practices. And I don't want to underestimate the value of spiritual practices that make quite strong use of conceptual thinking. And there are other practices that involve activity, physical activity. And Sheldrake talks about sport being a kind of spiritual practice in itself. And there are also yoga, martial arts, and other things where there is the activity of the physical body is a crucial part of the spiritual practice. And it's not difficult to see how you can use a cognitive architecture like ICS to model the differences in those kinds of spiritual practices. Philip started to do some of that modeling in his talk, for example, talking about how the Martin Laird approach to spiritual practice is different from the Jesus prayer and so on. I think ICS is potentially a really useful conceptual framework for formalizing and being more specific about these differences. One last quick thought. One of the crucial practical issues, I think, is how to change the implicational meanings that are dominant for each of us. And probably most of us have a mixture of implicational meanings that are helpful and unhelpful. Implicational meanings have far-reaching significance because they connect with both affect and behavior in a way that conceptual meanings don't. They tend to just sort of live in their own worlds. And one of the things that I'm intrigued to try and formalize is the process in which we can set in train the kind of interaction between conceptual and implicational meanings so that benign meanings are stabilized, and in spiritual intentions that are initially conceptual work over time to change the deep implicational meanings that guide our feelings and our behavior. That's enough from me, I think, but thanks for the opportunity to add some thoughts. So we have now a bit of time for free discussion, but perhaps first, Philip, I'll give you the opportunity, if you wish, to come back on anything that John or I have said before we open things up.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to come back on in the sense that I actually agree with a lot of what John is saying. I don't feel the need to challenge or debate aspects of that. He's doing, I mean, he and I play very different roles in terms of what is being elaborated here. So particularly in the context of your project, it seems to me that trying to find a way of actually being in a position to build models of spiritual practices at some point is a technical exercise that is worthwhile but different from what it takes to actually generate and guide self-understandings in a particular kind of way. So these are just complementary roles with what it is that you can do with a theory. There is nothing in conflict with them, and I think we share a pretty common understanding of what the principles underlying the operation of an architecture like ICS are. So that's fine. In relation to some of the remarks that you were making about conceptual understandings and implicational or holistic understandings, one of the things that's beginning to interest me in more and more ways, and partly some aspects of this are touched on in John's book again, about what happens. We develop implication, those deep models guide the control of thought and action. That's what they're there for, the deepest levels of synthesis. And we all follow a kind of developmental trajectory with those things. So I didn't pursue this, although I think I deleted the slide in the end, but throughout life, we are constantly having to refine our existing models. And sometimes we actually have to reorganize the whole lot because some kind of deep challenge comes up. I mean, if we look at a developmental trajectory, for example, during the terrible twos, a child transits between being somebody who is totally dependent as an agent on a mother or a carer to someone who has independent locomotion and can behave as an independent agent in the world. And at that point, you get all this enormous emotion coming out where the child is in effect remodeling its own deep agency in relation to thoughts and actions that are possible for it at that stage. A very similar thing occurs in adolescence when the hormones start flowing and you get social freedom to engage in more adult activities. Then again, it's often accompanied by a remodeling of all of the contingencies for controlling thought and behavior that is associated with intense affect. If you have brain damage, or become disabled in some way, you again have to remodel all of those things. And in fact, a rather lovely gentleman called Ilvisacker, who sadly died of cancer, he used ICS ideas to help treat patients from road traffic accidents who were no longer had the capabilities before. And in all of those instances, I'm experiencing it through aging now. I can't do the things that I used to do 10 years ago by any means. So we have things where there are refinements of modeling where you can titrate and gradually change incrementally small aspects of models that basically work. And then there are instances across the human lifespan where all of those modeling contingencies need to be restructured. And actually, I think what happens with the development of spiritual understandings very often is that it plays into those things, that there are two kinds of trajectory. One is the kinds of trajectories that enable you to uncover the holisms and supramodels, and another is where you're gradually producing new models or gradually refining the existing models that you've got. So I think there's a way of kind of saying, how can we express those contingencies and how do they differ across particular kinds of spiritual or other practices?
Thank you very much indeed. So let's move into a freer part of this meeting now, and with Roger's looking as though he might, but
you've spotted me, Fraser. Okay, I'll kick off. So as you were speaking, I was writing away. I have many questions, so maybe if I just go with one, maybe that would sort of be my contribution. Hey, having sort of heard your work and read your book recently, John, I keep thinking of Ian McGilchrist's work over and over and over again as you're kind of talking. And that sort of leads me to sort of two questions, really. The first is, when you read Ian McGilchrist, you get his sense that this sort of dominance of the conceptual system, if you like, it is cultural and historical rather than the default mode that human beings have always had. So I'm wondering if you agree with that. And then secondly, when I speak to neuroscientists about Ian McGilchrist, they seem much less receptive really to his work than sometimes I think you guys can be. So I'm just wondering, are we safe to read Ian McGilchrist as psychologists from your perspective? And secondly, do you think the dominance of the conceptual system is historical and cultural rather than sort of species inherent, if you like? Any thoughts?
Well, I'll certainly kick off with some of these things. I mean, I have to admit that I'm no great fan of Ian McGilchrist personally. I think that the allocation of left and right brain laterality contains a wonderful set of rhetoric and historical precedent in terms of what people have said about things and in terms of certain kinds of neuroimaging data, but that he oversteps the mark in terms of how it is that he draws inferences from the specialization of left and right brain function. I don't see it as working in quite the way that he does. And also, in terms of the historical aspects of it, I think you can reference back to different cultures in which certain things that he does say have a lot of resonances. So if you go into hunter-gatherer societies, for example, how they've trained their attention and their models and how they interact with the world is very different to the product of the Western educational system. You can take a highly educated Westerner and walk them through the land that Han in East Africa inhabit, and the Westerner will die, and the Han child will know where the underground storage organs are and all the rest of it, because they just pay attention to they have very different models of the world that they live in, and there are different kind of solutions to how it is that they live in that world that rely much more on global pattern recognition and some of the more implicational components, because they have to synthesize all that information to survive, whereas we're in Western field, we're trained to do things differently. So I do think that, you know, there are cultural things in terms of how it is that we develop those different models or emphasis, if you like, on left or right brain or implicational or propositional, whatever you want to call it, that are reflected in how it is that we grow up. And some of them are quite simple. You know, we all know that Eastern societies are shame-based and that Western societies are blame-based. So actually the coding, the meaning systems that we come and develop are culturally determined, but it isn't just as straightforward as left and right brain. I have difficulty with that. John, do you want to?
Okay. Well, it's interesting because Ian McGilchrist is one of the people who, although he's very clear, I think, in his writing about the centrality of a conversation between right hemisphere and left hemisphere, people reading it also seem to be prone to pick up the idea of, you know, right hemisphere good, left hemisphere bad, that really Fraser was pointing to. And certainly the ICS approach, I think, and I know at least one reviewer has welcomed it as sort of redressing that, you know, suggesting, as Fraser suggests, you know, a central role for conceptual knowing, because after all, you know, holistic intuitive knowing, implicational models, you know, integrate conceptual and sensory. You know, that's what they do. They're the highest level of integration. And so I think, you know, as Fraser pointed out, you know, it's crucial that we don't devalue, make a baddie of the conceptual way of knowing. I mean, the example I gave of the surgeon was a very interesting one in that respect, in the sense that, you can't get more conceptual in a way than some of the stuff in that book. And yet, having read it, that then enabled him to have this shift in view, that he could approach the same situation with a different potential model in hand, which then enabled him to reveal what was potentially already there. And as you know, if you've read the book, I mean, it suggests that one of the core aspects of mindfulness, which is knowing what you're doing as you're doing it, this meta awareness, is dependent on the two kinds of knowing each other, dependent on this conversation, on having conceptual labels very often for what's going on. Certainly certain meditation practices you probably wear, explicitly label things and encourage people to do that. As to whether in our innocent state of hunter-gatherhood, the natural state was one where holistic intuitive was in control. I would share Phil, as I interpret what Phil said, that basically, at that stage of evolution, our natural state was one much closer to those of our precursors. We had conceptual embellishment rather than conceptual dominance. That's I think what you said, Phil, wasn't it?
Yes, I mean, clearly, the hunter-gatherers had tools, and they were able to, they can make incredibly complex chemistry like compound adhesives and stuff like this. They do have conceptual knowing and they use it, but they aren't trained in the way in which we're trained through an educational process to make everything a particular kind of problem solving. They also, they have typically these story-based cultures. Without writing, they share things through narratives and stories, which are kind of, much more metaphorical and poetic in general in their expression. So their communication system and how it is that their culture is transmitted relies more on implicational meaning than the Oxford English Dictionary. And I think that those, it isn't one thing or the other, but if you look at the cultural basis of those things, that would be true. And I mean, I think Ian McGilchrist is picking up on a fundamental truth and then, I believe, running too far with it, running far too far with it. So if we go back to the bits of brains for the moment, there are certain things that are very clear. And if you were to model, if you were to try and map a wolf brain onto the four subsystems, it's pretty clear which bits do what. The multimodal synthesis is in the frontal lobes, right? The auditory synthesis is in the temporal lobes. The spatial one is in the parietal lobes, and the visual one is in the occipital lobe. So that structure is straightforward. Now, as architectures get more complex, you're having to use the same underlying wetware to do more jobs. So things like parts of the brain will be devoted to the new subsystem requirements. They'll have to get some wetware to do that job. And very often they'll be at the intersections of the previous systems. The phonology will start to be somewhere in and around the sound bit, but we'll be building upon that in interesting ways. But that will be happening typically in both hemispheres. But when you get into meaning systems, it may well be that more of the capacity and the intersections of the multimodality are happening in the right than in the left with some people, and actually vice versa in the other. So we have people who are left hemisphere, who aren't left hemisphere dominant. So it's kind of like there is a deep allocation of resources going on at a neural and mental architecture level, but we need to be very careful about oversimplifying how that happens. He doesn't have a theory of how it is that all of those things evolved in a systematic way that relate to specific capabilities. It all comes down to some very nice distinctions between, for example, broad attention and narrow attention. And as I've hoped I've illustrated today, actually attention doesn't need to be thought of as something like a spotlight that's got a wide angle lens and a narrow lens on it. It's actually just part and parcel of everything everywhere in the brain.
With lots of fascinating issues here. I'm tempted to pitch an at length, but I'll confine myself to just one brief thought. I think that Gilchrist is right in thinking there's a significant historical cultural shift. And I think the big shift is in the 17th century, and the new idea that you could understand things better by being detached and objective rather than participating in them. I think there's a lot of historical reasons for thinking that was a big driving idea in the 17th century. And I think McGilchrist is right that it's done potentially at least quite a lot of damage. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Who else would like to come in?
Well, I wasn't going to attempt to speak because discussion is a little bit above my pay grade. Usually I'm a theologian, so I reduce things to my understanding. So in trying to promote this event, I said that, well, Jesus said we should be as shrewd as snakes and innocent as doves. But Phil Barnard says that when we are doing mindfulness or the Jesus prayer, we are actually more like wolves, with a crucial twist, of course, of conceptual cognition. So that's my level of understanding of ICS. And thanks, Phil, for explaining to me the terrible twos which are currently causing my lack of focus during this webinar. My question is very naive, and it has to do with ontology rather than epistemology that you both talked about. I'm curious whether you think that engaging with reality in a spiritually intelligent way, as promoted through this rebalancing of the two main subsystems, whether this gives access to more real access to reality as it is, if there is anything like this. I mean, at least McGilchrist, for all his sins, he attempts to give a narrative of ontology and to say, well, what does the world look like if you see it through the prism of the right hemisphere? And surprise, surprise, it's exactly what poetry, religion, philosophy, good philosophy has been talking about for centuries. And I'm wondering whether you share that a healthy ICS functioning provides a glimpse into such a world or not. I mean, those higher order patterns, are they really in the world, or is it just that we are better off by seeing that kind of things? It's better for us, but not necessarily more true.
I think the issue of whether we ever see what's really real, is very problematic. As psychologists, I mean, say cognitive scientists, this would, I think, the prevailing view would be encapsulated by sort of Arnold Seth's approach, which is that our experience is of a controlled hallucination, in which basically it's not entirely produced by the mind, but it's a large production, but it's moderated by what's out there, what comes in, so that we're creating these models that are constrained by what's out there, but that probably can never really accurately reflect exactly what is out there.
Okay, I mean, one of the things that captivates me about how we might develop this kind of thinking, I mean, as John and I elaborated in our book on depression, that implicational meaning is actually expressed in poetry and metaphor and parable much better than it is in just simple, raw, naked propositions. And I think that reflects the fact that implicational meaning is much richer, and it's developed in a high dimensional space. So it is really intricate in ways that we cannot directly see. We cannot look into our implicational meaning system as a whole. We can only pull little bits out of it, seriate them into verbal thoughts. So something that is an enormously intricate matrix of meaning we can only pull out in kind of a sequence of two-dimensional frames of something that is very much richer. So I'm very captivated by the idea that actually our brains are more powerful than and minds are much more powerful than we know. And this is in part reflected by when John elaborates the idea that there are within us latent supramodels that we just need to get access to. I think that there's something really profound about that. I think we are we know much more than we can express. And it's the intangible nature of that that kind of intrigues me, that we cannot see over that. That's any help.
Could I just mention, I think I've remembered what I was going to say, which was in relation to your question about, do we see what is actually there, or are we actually creating it? I mean, the notion of this sort of basic way that the information processing system works, which is creating hierarchies, we're starting off with low-level parts and then finding the commonalities, creating higher-level wholes that are reflected, and then those wholes themselves becoming parts which feed into higher-level wholes, and so on and so on. It's widely recognized, been recognized for some time. That pattern is recognizable in the universe as a whole, in the physical universe. It's sort of our best scientific guesses seem to be that that's out there. And so, it obviously helps us, our minds, to find these patterns, because in nature, they are there. So this sense that we are in a way, knitted into the universe, and that there is this unfolding pattern out there, which we can align ourselves with, which takes you more into, I think, your area, the theology and, those wider metaphysical views, I find really exciting, and actually, it seems to me that could potentially provide an avenue into this whole potential area of healing, for people who don't have pre-existing, religious experience or traditions, and it seems to me that sense of wholeness and integration and interrelatedness is what the world is crying out for at the moment.
There's an absolutely wonderful article in this month's New Scientist, which I haven't yet told John about, which I'm going to send to him shortly, which is basically that, physics, our current physics doesn't work. Because, we know various things at the quantum level and the gravity level, and they don't all fit together. But we're looking for solutions that go to smaller and smaller particles and divisions, and whether or not we can encounter a new physics. And now there's a movement which is very eloquently described in this thing that says, no, this is all wrong. We're just thinking about it in the wrong way. The universe, we can understand entanglement in the universe, that everything is one single quantum wave function, and that everything is related to everything else. There is just one thing where the divisions are just a reflection of that.
We're almost out of time, but Roger, if you have a last question, you're welcome to come in.
I'll try and ask it very quickly in the hope of a very short answer. So one of the things that really intrigues me, particularly in sort of many modern spirituality movements, is the way in which spiritual practices are sold in a very sort of instrumentalist kind of way. So gratitude suddenly becomes this thing, if you do, it will do you well, which somehow defeats the whole process of the practice in itself. I'm just wondering, from this model, what either or both of you would make of that, and is it that something that perhaps is holistic and intuitive is being sold to us almost in a purely conceptual and instrumental way? And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, and how we can perhaps avoid it or remedy that tendency.
Yeah, I think you put your finger on something crucially important that I do address. I mean, maybe not quite as explicitly as I might in the book, in terms of distinguishing between instrumental awareness and non-instrumental awareness, where non-instrumental awareness is something that you do you engage in it for the love of it, like with flow, whereas instrumental awareness is something that can be used in the service of, a goal-focused project to become a better self, if you like. I'm going to be a relaxed self, an enlightened self, whatever kind of self. And the tragedy about that is that you might get some short-term effects, but you're dooming people to long-term frustration, I think, because they're still on the path that's just creating the suffering. I think it's a pernicious thing that, but actually, certainly some of the feedback I've got has been that laying it out in a systematic model, that's what happens. Just you do A, then B follows, seems to be very helpful to people, saying, it's not that you're being naughty or, selfish in the bad kind of way, but if you want to be wise, then don't go there, kind of thing. It may, if you're gonna go there in that sense, have the possibility at the back of your mind that something else is possible. Otherwise, you just end up trying harder and harder and harder to become this relaxed, mindful, enlightened self.
Thank you very much. We should probably finish at this point. So thank you to everyone for being here, and particularly thank you to Philip and John for great contributions to this afternoon's session.
Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed what you have seen and or heard here today, please consider clicking that like button and or subscribing to stay up to date on all the happenings with ISSR. And let us know which discussions you would like to see next in the comments below. We have many more interesting discussions available, so be sure to check out the rest of what we have posted on our channels and on our website for more academic discussions and content related to the field of science and religion. Bye for now, and see you at the next ISSR in Conversation.